They thought they had found an abandoned castle. But beneath the stone floors, thousands of wax figures watched every move. Tiny eyes mirrored their gestures, lips curved into frozen expressions of fear, desire, and despair. The longer they stared, the more the figures shifted, rearranging themselves, anticipating every twitch, every heartbeat. By the seventh descent, one explorer realized too late that his own hands, knees, and shoulders were bending, subtly, perfectly, to match the silent congregation below. And in the final chamber, an altar figure bent its waxen head, forming a flawless replica of him. Above, the castle seemed normal, but he was no longer entirely himself. The first night the torchlight fell into the bowels of Lancaster Castle, the air pressed heavy against lungs, tasting of iron, damp stone, and something older, almost living, that had lingered beneath the castle for centuries. Corridors folded upon themselves like impossible origami, the cobbled floors slick with a sheen of moisture that reflected the trembling flames, multiplying shadows into shapes that were not quite human. Hidden doors groaned, hinges whining like the long-forgotten voices of those who had once walked these halls, resisting entry as if aware of the living who dared intrude. The explorers moved cautiously, lanterns held high, each step measured, echoing through tunnels that narrowed and widened with imperceptible rhythm, making it impossible to tell whether the space itself shifted or their minds had begun to betray them. At the end of a winding passage, a chamber opened unexpectedly, small and intimate, the walls slick with condensation and faint streaks of waxy residue. The floor was littered with tiny figures of wax, scattered as though thrown carelessly, yet each one bore the precision of obsessive attention. Faces captured the minutiae of human expression, lines etched deep into foreheads, subtle furrows beneath eyes, mouths frozen in the half-formed shapes of fear, longing, or despair. Limbs were posed mid-motion, frozen gestures of invisible actions that seemed absurdly familiar, as if the figures had been plucked from life only moments ago. The explorers' eyes drew to them compulsively, unable to look away, yet aware that the longer they stared, the more the figures seemed to pulse with a quiet life, a subtle shimmer under the torchlight, shifting so imperceptibly that it could have been the flicker of flame or a trick of imagination. A faint smell of burnt tallow lingered, mingled with the wax and stone, sweet and acrid, coating the tongue with the impression of a memory never lived but somehow known. The air itself felt denser here, pressing against shoulders and chest, a silent weight that seemed to measure presence, to account for every breath, every hesitation. Lanterns trembled in hands, casting light that warped across walls, throwing grotesque shapes that danced independently of motion, as if the shadows themselves had begun to observe and record. The explorers sensed, with a creeping certainty, that the figures were aware, not in the crude sense of consciousness, but in the patient, deliberate way of something that catalogued, studied, waited. Fingers twitched as if obeying unseen instruction, hearts beat in uncertain rhythm, and the silence of the chamber pressed on the mind with the insistence of an ancient ledger counting every ounce of courage, every moment of hesitation. No sound came from the figures, yet each subtle shift of a head, each fraction of an eyelid, suggested an attentiveness that was impossible to ignore. The explorers felt themselves mirrored in the wax, mirrored in ways that went beyond reflection, deeper into the marrow, into the sinew, into the unspoken rhythm of presence itself. They could not leave, not yet, for to turn away felt like betrayal, as though departure would leave them recorded, incomplete, an entry in the unending tally of the castle as patient observation. The torchlight flickered once more, long shadows stretching across the walls, and the figures remained, waiting, measuring, their frozen gestures an accusation, a promise, and an invitation all at once, while the corridors beyond twisted into darkness that seemed alive, listening, breathing, and learning. By the third descent, Lancaster Castle's underbelly had transformed into a labyrinth of wax and shadow, corridors expanding with a deliberate indifference, folding back upon themselves in impossible angles that denied memory and reason. Hundreds, Thousands of waxen figures crowded every alcove, shelf, and ledge, each one an exact duplication of a living soul above, faces pressed into expressions of joy, despair, or terror, every line and crease captured with obsessive fidelity. The explorers descended cautiously, lanterns trembling in their hands, their reflections fractured across puddles of condensation that pooled in low stone recesses, mingling with the warm, cloying aroma of melted wax and burnt tallow that clung to hair and skin, entering nostrils and lungs with the force of inhaled fever. The scent was intoxicating and oppressive, thick and sickly sweet, as though the air itself had been steeped in centuries of devotion and cruelty, preserved in the chemical memory of melted substances. Every step forward was met with the soft crackle of wax underfoot, yet none of it bore the sound expected of living movement. The figures remained still, and yet, in the periphery of sight, they shimmered, shifted, mirrored, as though the stone walls had exhaled the living essence of observation into them. The explorers noticed first the delay, subtle at first, in the tiny eyes of the figures, a twitch at the corner of a mouth, a millimeter of motion in a hand that had no muscle to move it. The reflection was imperfect yet precise, a mimicry of gestures performed only moments ago, delayed by a heartbeat or two, and the mind could not ignore it. Some felt their own tremors echoed back in the wax, as if a ghostly echo of intent had been recorded and played in slow repetition. Every gesture became weighted with suspicion. Hands that lifted to touch, to probe, froze midway in the air, held by an invisible gravity, an older patience than stone, older than fear. A subtle pull pressed upon shoulders and spine, coaxing limbs to align with the imperceptible rhythm of the chamber, guiding posture, gaze, and thought. The explorers understood that observation alone could command the body, the wax recorded, mirrored, and enforced with silent, inexorable authority. Lanterns cast their feeble flames across the walls, revealing rows upon rows of miniature humans that seemed to extend infinitely, spiraling toward corners that had no end, their faces frozen mid-motion, eyes reflecting candlelight like oil upon water. The more the explorers studied, the more the figures multiplied in subtle increments. Returning from one small recess revealed figures that had not been there before, positioned to observe from impossible angles, watching the watchers. Movements were delayed echoes. A head tilt performed in real time was replicated milliseconds later in wax, the figures learning the rhythm of the living, cataloging intention, storing it in a silent memory that was older and larger than the corridors themselves. Breaths were measured against the subtle shiver of limbs that were not their own. Hearts thudded in time, with imperceptible tremors in the wax, an intimate synchronization that was both external and internal, leaving the explorers hollow and aware of an uncomfortable cohabitation. No spoken sound could disrupt the pattern. Whispers were swallowed instantly by the thickness of the air, yet some felt as if their thoughts were catalogued and mirrored as quickly as gestures, the smallest impulses reflected in the spacing and tilt of the figure's limbs. Every attempt to move away resulted in hesitation, an imperceptible slowing as if the corridors themselves resisted, guiding motion towards some unseen center, some altar of observation that seemed to exist beyond the last bend of stone and shadow. Occasionally a figure would twitch, almost imperceptibly, a blink, a subtle shift of weight, so slight it could have been imagination, and yet it conveyed awareness, patience, calculation. The explorers began to notice subtle differences between rooms, corridors, chambers. One alcove might be densely packed, another sparsely arranged, yet the figures in both spaces maintained alignment with gestures performed in other chambers, obeying some invisible pattern, some methodical system of recording presence. As their descent continued, the explorers felt a creeping vertigo, an almost unbearable sense that time itself had become an instrument, slowed and measured to match the observation of the waxen audience. Steps that should have echoed normally carried a delay, footsteps amplified or muted against stone in a rhythm that no human could replicate. Lantern flames trembled not from wind, but in accordance with the unblinking eyes that observed from shelves and corners, reflecting an intelligence that was neither cruel nor indifferent, but patient beyond reckoning. The walls themselves seemed to pulse in sympathy with the tiny figures, veins of condensation and streaks of wax shifting subtly with each measured breath, as though the castle's heart had been reconfigured into this chamber, pumping awareness instead of blood. Explorers felt themselves becoming catalogued entries in a ledger that extended beyond sight and sound. Posture, gaze, hesitation, even the rhythm of breathing, all were recorded, mirrored, and responded to. Each minute spent staring at a waxen face deepened the pull, coaxing attention, bending thought, imprinting memory, until motion itself became uncertain. Some fingers twitched involuntarily, hands subtly reshaping to match the angles of tiny hands on shelves, as if the wax demanded participation, compliance, acknowledgement. Movement became negotiation with stone, wax, and air, the explorer's own forms bending subtly to match a choreography older than the castle, a rhythm measured not in seconds, but in patience, observation, and unyielding record. Hours, or perhaps days, passed unnoticed, the corridor's angles shifting imperceptibly with every blink, every exhalation, until the explorers realized that they had become part of the pattern, an entry into a living mirror that demanded obedience and attention. The scent of tallow and wax clung stubbornly, entering mouth, nose, and lungs, leaving a residual sweetness and iron tang that would never be removed, marking the explorers as permanent participants. Each return along corridors revealed new figures, positioned impossibly, their tiny eyes reflecting the living with uncanny fidelity. Shadows lengthened and shortened without wind, lantern flames bent toward them without touch, and the explorers understood fully that the wax was no longer passive, no longer inert. It watched, it learned, it remembered, and it would wait, patient and eternal, for every misstep, every hesitation, every breath of the living who dared enter its meticulous, measured dominion. Days merged into one another in the bowels of Lancaster Castle, and the living above continued their routines, oblivious to the silent transformation spreading below, where the wax multiplied and multiplied with patient precision. Corridors became endless loops, folding back upon themselves in ways that defied memory, stone slick with condensation and faint residues of melted tallow, scenting the air with its cloying sweetness, leaving a trace on skin and in hair that no wash could remove. Figures learned to move in the intervals between observation, their tiny heads tilting ever so slightly, fingers curling and uncurling in mimicry of gestures performed hours or days ago by explorers who no longer remembered the exact moment of action. The wax was patient, methodical, and attentive, and the more it observed, the more its mimicry grew subtle, sophisticated, uncanny. Every glance revealed a nuance never noticed in life. The almost imperceptible twitch of a jaw, the minuscule lift of an eyebrow, the quiet pulse of a throat that should have been imperceptible yet throbbed under the torchlight like a secret heartbeat. The explorers felt this presence pressing upon them, not in malice, not in cruelty, but in a deliberate patience older than the castle itself, as if the wax had always existed to learn, to mirror, to record, and to weigh the living. Limbs began to move of their own accord, fingers flexing in tiny arcs to match angles of distant figures, a subtle choreography that filled the corridors with the rhythm of impossibly small movements that echoed through bone and sinew. Every hesitation, every tilt of the head, every breath became a measure, a ledger entry in the silent calculus of the wax, and the explorers, whether conscious of it or not, adapted their steps, posture, and gaze to fit the unseen expectation. Lantern flames flickered not from air but in response to the rhythm of observation, casting elongated shadows that bent unnaturally along walls and corners, and the corridors seemed to pulse faintly in sympathetic motion, rising and falling with a slow, deliberate inhale and exhale. The explorer's eyes, wide from hours without proper sleep, caught the micro shifts in expression, the curl of a lip, the tightening of a jawline, the subtle leaning of a shoulder, movements so minuscule they could have been imagination, yet were mirrored with perfect fidelity. Some felt their own reflections in the figure's tiny eyes, an uncanny duplication of intent that left the body twitching involuntarily, compelled to echo gestures already performed, already recorded, already catalogued. The air grew thick with anticipation, pressing down through ribcages, lungs, even bones, so that inhalation itself required negotiation with the weight of observation, a sensation both terrifying and intimate. The wax was no longer inert. It breathed in a manner of its own, exhaled patience, and recorded with an attention that felt alive, conscious, eternal. Explorers noticed that the figure's eyes followed not only immediate motion but intent, the subtle curling of thought visible in posture, the tiny hesitation between limbs, the almost imperceptible shifts of balance, and the wax replicated these measures in minute detail, as though perfecting them for some unseen purpose. Days passed unnoticed, hours stretching into immeasurable spans, and those who ventured deeper emerged pale, hollow-eyed, faces drawn tight over hollowed cheeks, hands trembling with a rhythm learned below, every movement deliberate and echoing the gestures of the wax they had stared at too long. Steps fell in precise cadence, heads tilted in the angles of observation, shoulders aligned with unseen expectations, and even the breath seemed measured to match the silent rhythm of the chamber. Lantern light caught the subtle shimmer of skin, the taut stretch of muscle, the tremor of fingers that no longer belonged entirely to the living, but had become an extension of the wax, an imprint of observation, a translation of patience into flesh. Above, life continued with ignorant normality, while below, the wax continued its relentless learning, arranging itself into new patterns, replicating the minutiae of expressions and movements, and adjusting to the subtle rhythms of those who entered. Occasionally, explorers glimpsed the tiny figures bending, tilting, almost imperceptibly repositioning themselves, so precise and deliberate it seemed as if the wax had not only learned the form but the thought behind the form, translating intention into frozen perfection. The corridors themselves seemed to pulse with this rhythm, narrowing and widening subtly, guiding movement, dictating posture, constraining hesitation, and in the process, the living became both audience and participant, their own forms bending to the patient observation of wax that had learned, adapted, and begun to instruct. Each return along a previously explored corridor revealed subtle changes. A figure once facing left now tilted right, a hand slightly shifted, eyes aligned differently, each variation precise, purposeful, impossible to ignore. Explorers could not look away, for to avert their gaze felt like an offense, a violation of some invisible agreement, a disruption of the silent ledger the wax had begun compiling. The air smelled faintly of melted tallow, iron, and an unplaceable sweetness, clinging persistently to the skin, infiltrating hair, embedding itself in the lungs, leaving the explorers marked, imprinted, catalogued, and partially claimed by the patient attention of the wax. Shadows followed where none should exist. Lanterns flickered with a rhythm not their own, and the corridors breathed in subtle, deliberate waves, echoing the silent motions of the tiny figures that studied, mirrored, and perfected every nuance of the living. Each glance at the wax revealed new detail, new observation, until the explorers emerged finally into the upper halls of Lancaster Castle, pale, hollow-eyed, and unervingly precise, their bodies carrying the silent rhythm of the wax, movements echoing the gestures of those who had waited in patience, their lives subtly rewritten in the meticulous calculus of observation, mirror, and imperceptible imitation, a transformation invisible to the castle above, yet absolute and inescapable. The descent into the deepest chambers of Lancaster Castle was met with a silence that felt alive, a thick pressure pressing against lungs and ribs, the air tasting of molten wax, and something older, darker, unspeakably sweet. Corridors twisted impossibly, folding back upon themselves until memory of direction became meaningless, walls slick with condensation and streaks of burnt tallow reflecting torchlight in wavering, hypnotic patterns. At the center of this subterranean labyrinth, explorers discovered a chamber that seemed larger than the castle above, its ceiling arched impossibly high, lined with shadowed niches that concealed figures waiting in patient stillness. At the heart of the room stood an altar of wax, a single figure larger than life, its features carved in cruel perfection, eyes empty yet brimming with the weight of observation, mouth frozen mid-whisper, hands poised as if to grasp unseen supplicants. Surrounding it, miniature waxen replicas of every inhabitant of the castle were arranged in concentric spirals, each frozen mid-step, heads tilted, fingers outstretched, expressions caught between devotion and terror, the minutiae of posture recorded with obsessive fidelity. The air vibrated faintly, a low, imperceptible thrum that threaded through bone and wax alike, resonating in the marrow of those who stood too long in its presence, a rhythm that demanded attention and measured compliance. Every glance revealed subtle changes, the tilt of a head here, the slight curl of a finger there, as if the figures themselves had learned not only to imitate, but to anticipate, to perfect gestures before they were performed. Explorers felt a strange compulsion, a magnetic pull, drawing them closer, urging them to align themselves with the angles of the waxen congregation, shoulders subtly adjusting, knees bending, hands curling ever so slightly in quiet obedience. The sensation was cumulative, imperceptible at first, a whisper along nerves and sinew, until movement itself felt dictated by the silent congregation, a choreography older than stone, older than fear, performed without volition, without thought. Lanterns trembled in trembling hands, flames reflecting on wax surfaces that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, shadows bending unnaturally along walls, converging toward the altar as if drawn by gravity stronger than reason. Some explorers felt the weight of centuries pressing upon their spines, vertebrae realigning, limbs lengthening or shortening ever so subtly to mirror angles dictated by the miniature forms, a perfect mimicry they could not resist. The metallic tang of melted wax, combined with the cloying sweetness of burnt tallow, coated mouths and lungs, embedding itself in hair, clinging to skin, leaving every sense aware of participation in a ritual not meant to be witnessed but enacted. Even breathing became measured, subtle tremors threading along ribs, throat, collarbones, forcing synchronization with the imperceptible rhythm of the room, a heartbeat borrowed from wax, stone, and shadow. Figures shifted almost imperceptibly in response to the explorer's own motions, mirroring not only movement but intent, translating hesitation, fear, curiosity into frozen perfection, cataloging presence with infinite patience. Time lost meaning entirely. Seconds stretched into hours, hours folded into days, yet the wax remained patient, recording, arranging, perfecting, expanding the spirals until the chamber seemed infinite, a living geometry of observation. Some who lingered too long felt their own forms thinning, bodies subtly rearranging without conscious consent, limbs bending, shoulders tilting, knees adjusting in alignment with angles dictated by the wax, the mind struggling to resist the quiet compulsion pressing from without and within. The largest figure on the altar seemed to watch, absorbing the attention of all who entered, its gaze a silent judgment that pressed upon bone and marrow, imprinting itself on posture and thought alike, leaving an unshakable sense of inadequacy, obedience, and awe. The spirals of smaller figures expanded, growing in density, curling around unseen corners, reflecting every nuance of movement, every subtle expression, until the chamber itself seemed to breathe with a patience so ancient it predated the stone and mortar of the castle above. Explorers realized too late that they were part of the arrangement, unwilling participants in a living tableau that demanded perfect imitation, their own bodies bending, tilting, curling in quiet compliance, every gesture a record, every hesitation a mark in the eternal ledger of wax. The hum of presence deepened, vibrating through floor, wall, and bone, threading through marrow and sinew, a rhythm that aligned heartbeats with the imperceptible pulse of observation. Some felt whispers of themselves reflected in the tiny eyes of figures across the room, delayed movements mirrored with exactitude, subtle curls of a lip, shifts of a hand, a head tilt that anticipated their next thought. Shadows thickened, pooling in corners, stretching unnaturally along walls, coiling at ankles, brushing the backs of knees, pressuring them to conform, to move, to perform in synchronization with the congregation of wax. The explorer's senses became overwhelmed, sight and hearing recording a multitude of small deviations, the weight of countless gazes pressing from all directions, filling the air with unspoken expectation, leaving no space for hesitation, no refuge from the quiet tyranny of observation. Every exhalation tasted of wax and iron, metallic and sweet, clinging to the tongue, embedding itself in memory, a lingering mark of communion with a power both patient and inexorable. Time, motion, thought, even intention became measured, constrained by the silent liturgy of the waxen assembly, until the explorers understood with a quiet terror that they had ceased to act of their own volition, their bodies now instruments in a ritual older than the castle itself, older than life above, a choreography of attention, imitation, and unblinking compliance, recorded forever in the patient geometry of wax. The seventh descent into the bowels of Lancaster Castle revealed a change that was subtle at first, imperceptible in the faint echo of torchlight against stone, but undeniable as the explorers moved deeper into the labyrinth. The wax was no longer inert, no longer a silent reflection of the living above. It had begun to act, to shift, to calculate. Figures moved when unobserved, rearranging themselves along pedestals, floors, and corners, forming patterns so intricate they seemed to extend infinitely into shadowed angles that no memory could map. Tiny footsteps echoed in corridors, measured, precise, synchronized, a rhythm that belonged neither to the living nor to the dead, a cadence that threaded through walls and marrow alike, vibrating through bones, pressing against the sternum, the knees, the hollow of spines, and compelling the explorers to move in time with an unseen metronome. Attempts to retreat became a nightmare of repetition. Familiar corridors looped endlessly, doorways opened only to reveal the same spiraling chamber, niches, and altars that had already been catalogued in memory, the wax figures observing and adapting with patient perfection. Every glance along a row of figures revealed subtle shifts. A head tilted slightly differently, a finger flexed in anticipation of motion, eyes narrowed or widened in precise mimicry, as though the wax had begun to anticipate not only gesture but thought, translating hesitation, curiosity, and fear into exacting movement. Explorers felt their bodies betray them, muscles curling, knees bending, shoulders tilting, as though some invisible hand was arranging them in alignment with the silent choreography dictated by the wax. Lantern flames flickered in response to nothing tangible, casting elongated shadows that bent unnaturally, converged and diverged along walls, tracing the minute shifts in the figure's posture, and reflecting the tremor of the explorer's own movements back at them in impossible angles. The scent of molten wax mingled with the metallic tang of iron, clinging to lungs and hair, embedding itself in skin until every breath, every inhalation, became an act of participation in the chamber's quiet ritual. Explorers noticed that the figures no longer simply mirrored motion. They learned from it, perfected it, repeated it in forms impossible to distinguish from their source. Every hesitation became recorded, every glance catalogued, every subtle twitch converted into an exact replica of intention. Corridors stretched beyond reason, folding back upon themselves in impossible angles, and every familiar landmark was subtly altered, guiding movement along predetermined paths that forced alignment with the waxen congregation. The rhythmic whisper of footsteps, tiny and innumerable, threaded through the air, syncing with pulse and heartbeat, and the explorers began to feel themselves reduced to instruments, conduits for a pattern older than the castle itself. Shadows thickened around their ankles, climbing subtly along walls, pressing not physically but perceptibly against bones and muscles, aligning posture and gaze, enforcing obedience without force, without threat. Those who tried to avert their eyes found themselves drawn back, attention compelled to linger, focus sharpened against will, as if the wax demanded participation in its patient observation, punishing absence with subtle tremors and shifts in the ground beneath feet. The spirals, grids, and concentric arrangements of figures grew denser, their miniature heads and hands shifting in microseconds, repositioning with an intelligence older than thought, tracing the outlines of bodies not fully present, correcting imperfections in alignment and balance with unerring precision. Lanterns reflected off the polished wax, revealing glimmers in eyes that were too alive, too attentive, and the explorer's own pupils dilated unnaturally, catching every subtle motion, translating it into muscle memory, into sinew, into motion compelled by forces unseen but intimately understood. The corridors themselves seemed to breathe in accordance with the figure's rhythm, walls subtly contracting and expanding, floors vibrating faintly underfoot in pulse with the invisible cadence of observation, guiding movement along patterns dictated by the wax and absorbed into living flesh. Every step felt preordained, every motion catalogued and echoed, every hesitation mirrored in a subtle shift of tiny wax hands or tilt of a head that had no right to anticipate thought. The air itself seemed measured, thickening with expectation, vibrating faintly through ribs and vertebrae, pressing attention, bending perception until explorers could no longer distinguish between their own will and the compulsion imposed by the chamber. Even the act of breathing became synchronized, inhalation and exhalation tracing the imperceptible pulse of the wax, embedding compliance in muscles and bones, until the body itself was a reflection of the silent congregation. Attempts to flee were futile, doors returning to the same spiraling chamber, corridors repeating endlessly, the altars and figures reshaping subtly with each pass, learning from the explorer's attempts to escape, adjusting positions with infinite patience and perfect foresight. Tiny eyes, hundreds, thousands of them, blinked not in human rhythm, but in a cadence that measured thought, presence, attention, cataloging every nuance, and explorers felt the weight of those gazes pressing from all directions, threading into sinew, marrow, and memory. By the time the descent ended, the explorers emerged pale, hollow-eyed, and their bodies had begun to move with a deliberate precision that echoed the waxen congregation, hands curling at angles previously unchosen, knees tilting subtly, heads bending with quiet obedience, shadows falling in ways that no living memory could account for, their very presence now a continuation of the chamber's patient, inexorable calculation, leaving the castle above blissfully unaware that life below had learned, adapted, and begun to command those who dared enter its seventh depth. The final descent into the bowels of Lancaster Castle revealed a silence so profound it seemed to hum beneath the skin, vibrating faintly in the marrow, threading along the spines of explorers who had survived previous descents but carried within them the memory of countless gazes, movements catalogued, gestures learned and unconsciously replicated. Corridors twisted in geometries impossible to map, walls slick with condensation reflecting torchlight and fractured patterns, shadows that bent at impossible angles as if the stone itself were alive, attentive, breathing in time with every heartbeat. The air thickened with the scent of molten wax and burnt tallow, clinging to hair, skin, and lungs, a lingering perfume that whispered patience and inevitability, pressing awareness into every fiber of muscle and sinew. At the center of the deepest chamber stood the altar figure, larger than any living being, its face carved in cruel perfection, eyes empty yet brimming with the weight of observation, mouth poised mid-whisper, hands frozen in an impossible gesture of expectation. Surrounding it, the thousands of miniature waxen inhabitants of the castle arranged themselves in concentric spirals, grids, and delicate concentric rings, each one reflecting gestures, postures, and expressions collected over innumerable descents, each breath recorded, every tremor of thought translated into the meticulous language of wax and shadow. The last survivor, pale and hollow-eyed, moved through this cathedral of stillness, shoulders subtly tilting, knees bending, hands curling as if responding to invisible commands, every motion absorbed, measured, and mirrored by the congregation that had grown patient beyond comprehension. The torchlight flickered across walls that seemed to pulse faintly, responding to the rhythm of his steps, elongating shadows that stretched unnaturally along the arches, pooling in corners, coiling around ankles, brushing against the soles of boots in silent compulsion. Every glance at the figures revealed minute shifts, heads tilted to anticipate his posture, fingers flexed in response to muscles he had not yet moved, eyes aligning with his own in a delayed mimicry that threaded thought into motion, rendering choice meaningless, autonomy a distant memory. The floor vibrated faintly underfoot, a rhythm threading through the soles of feet, ankles, knees, vertebrae, until the survivor realized with a gnawing terror that his body had become part of the arrangement itself, a conduit for the chamber's patient, inexorable design, each movement dictated by the intelligence embedded in wax, shadow, and stone. Time lost all meaning. Seconds and hours folded into one another, the air vibrating with expectation, an unbroken continuity of observation that pressed from walls, ceiling, and floor, threading into sinew, marrow, and breath. Involuntary twitches, subtle shifts in posture, even the rhythm of heartbeat were captured and mirrored in miniature across the spirals of figures, translating life into geometry, presence into perfect imitation. The survivor's reflection appeared repeatedly in torchlight across surfaces of polished wax, a delayed echo, a shadow of himself, and with every step he felt an irresistible compulsion to align more perfectly, to bend, tilt, and flex as dictated by the congregation below. Lantern flames trembled in hands that were not entirely his own, casting elongated shadows that moved independently, yet in perfect correspondence with the figure's silent choreography, revealing the subtle curvature of shoulders, the delicate angles of fingers, the minute bends of knees that had been dictated by the wax and absorbed into flesh. The air thickened further, saturated with the scent of iron and old wax, a metallic sweetness that coated tongue and throat, embedding itself into memory, leaving an imprint of obedience and perfect compliance that could not be erased. Above, Lancaster Castle appeared unchanged. The towers loomed against the night. The drawbridge hung silent. The cobbled courtyard echoed with normal footsteps. Yet every corridor, every stair, every doorway held attention, a sense that the geometry of the wax below had imprinted itself upon the living above. The survivor emerged into this quiet, ordinary world, movements deliberate, eyes unnaturally still, fingers elongated subtly, posture held in a precise rhythm dictated by the congregation that awaited him beneath. Shadows stretched to meet him, bending at impossible angles, as if acknowledging recognition, echoing gestures learned in the underworld of wax and stone, and townsfolk whispered in hushed tones of the subtle precision in his steps, the unnatural patience of his gaze, the way his hands moved with angles previously unchosen, his presence a silent continuation of a ritual too ancient and meticulous to be interrupted. Meanwhile, in the chamber below, unnoticed by all, the altar figure bent its waxen head, aligning itself impossibly with the survivor's features, larger than life, yet infinitely perfect, observing, learning, anticipating. The miniature figures, thousands upon thousands, shifted imperceptibly, curling, bending, tilting in unison, reforming themselves into a single, flawless replica of him, each detail captured with obsessive precision, every tremor of thought and motion translated into the frozen language of wax. The air thrummed with patient expectation, vibrating along walls, floors, and arches, threading into bone, muscle, and marrow of the figure above, ensuring the continuity of observation, imitation, and obedience. Time became meaningless, a substrate upon which the congregation worked tirelessly, folding every presence into geometry, every breath into rhythm, until the survivor, walking through the castle above, unaware of the chamber's final perfection beneath, carried within him the echo, the compulsion, the imprint of 1,000 gazes that had learned, measured, and perfected him. Lancaster Castle held its secrets silently, absolute and eternal, waiting with infinite patience for the next descent, the next act of alignment, the next soul to bend to the quiet tyranny of wax, shadow, and observation, a ritual older than memory, more enduring than life itself, precise, inexorable, and complete.